Good evening, I'm Tom Sikovitz. Tonight and for the next 4 nights, KRON-4 will continue its award-winning journey back in time. We've assembled an outstanding team of historians to bring you the power, the tragedy, and the triumph of this incredible place we call home. And now, KRON-4 presents San Francisco, Birth of a City.
It was the new Eden, a place of discovery, conquest, desire. Its first inhabitants arrived thousands of years ago from Asia, a native people called Costanoans, Miwok, Ohlone. They will be vanquished by colonial rule and religious intrusion. A land of foreign exploration, it was the Spanish who discovered the Bay of San Francisco, built an army garrison, the Presidio, and in 1776 celebrated Catholic Mass on the site of the Church of Mission Dolores. Spain will govern this part of her colonial empire for almost half a century, until Mexico revolts and seizes control. From a windswept land of sand dunes, chaparral, and scrubby vegetation, a great city will rise. And it will be named for a saint, Saint Francis of Assisi. A 19th century American Army officer, John Charles Fremont, is captivated by the magic of the bay and calls its entrance the Golden Gate. Transformed by the discovery of gold, this new Eden will become the epicenter of a great human drama, enchanting, nightmarish, filled with tragedy and triumph.
Right from the beginning, from the time of all the visitors from all the world, the tip of the peninsula of San Francisco and the surrounding San Francisco Bay beckoned, bespoke the possibilities that someday a great city would rise up here.
The city of San Francisco was born during the time of Mexican rule. Located halfway between the Presidio and Mission Dolores, it was originally called Yerba Buena, Spanish for the good herb, which smelled of mint and was found growing in abundance on the hills overlooking its great natural harbor. William Richardson, an English seaman, became its first resident in 1835. A year later, 26-year-old Jacob P. Lease became Yerba Buena's second resident. Born in Ohio, Lease came west to seek his fortune.
I think he first came to San Francisco purely in a spirit of adventure.
96-year-old Adrian Michealis is the great-grandson and oldest living relative of Jacob P. Lease.
He came to a land that was practically undeveloped, but he had the brains to see what the possibilities were. He was a merchant, he was a trader, he was a landowner. I would have called him an entrepreneur.
Lee saw the potential of the bay and built his home and business on the street which is known today as Grant Avenue. To mark the occasion, Lease had a party on the 4th of July. It was both housewarming and celebration of American independence.
They seem to have had such a good time that in his diary he wrote that the celebration of the 4th of July ended on the evening of the 5th. So I imagine they had a good time.
Among the guests was General Mariano Vallejo, Mexico's commander of the northern frontier of California. Vallejo brought his sister Rosalia to the party, and Lease fell in love with her. They married a year later and would have 10 children. Their first, a girl also named Rosalia, was the first child born in the settlement of Yerba Buena. Lise achieved success, but eventually moved away. And though his later years were marked by failure, he will be remembered as a pioneer, forever linked to the city's early days as a man who played a historic role in the beginnings of San Francisco. In the immediate years after Lisa's departure, Yerba Buena remained a small seaport of a few hundred residents, trading with ships from around the world. In 1846, America went to war with Mexico and seized control of California. A year later, Washington Bartlett, the Navy lieutenant who governed Yerba Buena, renamed it San Francisco. San Francisco. It will be changed forever by the fury of the gold rush.
There is no greater event in San Francisco's history than the gold rush, because San Francisco was both the birthplace and the gateway to the gold rush.
In January of 1848, in the Sierra foothills, gold was discovered by James Marshall at Sutter's mill on the American River. John Sutter wanted to keep it secret, but the extraordinary news of a gold strike soon leaked out. San Francisco's population was just over 800 when a Mormon merchant who published the town's first newspaper and became one of its first millionaires confirmed the discovery of gold.
The gold rush didn't really get started until May 12, 1848, and that's when a man by the name of Sam Brannan came down to San Francisco, marched across Portsmouth Square waving a bottle of gold dust over his head, yelling, "Gold, gold, gold from the American River."
By the end of the year, President James Polk officially announced the news to Congress and the rest of the world. The gold rush was on, creating one of the greatest mass migrations in history.
There was a time in 1849 when the population of San Francisco was doubling every 10 days. And San Francisco, almost overnight, was changed from a pastoral little village into a bustling metropolis.
People came from everywhere, overland across country, by sea around Cape Horn. San Francisco's harbor soon filled with sailing ships from all over the world. Some 20,000 people came by the end of '48, 100,000 by the next year, and by the end of 1852, 250,000 people had arrived in California. San Francisco was a multicultural city from the start.
You find Yankees, Southerners, Sonorans, Chileans, Australians, Chinese, Kanakas or Hawaiians, Filipinos. Every type of cultural strain would be represented here.
There were also Germans, Italians, blacks, European Jews, and the Irish. Among San Francisco's largest immigrant groups were the French, who offered their new city a Parisian sense of style and urbanism.
When you walked through the streets, according to American immigrants, you really felt that you were in Paris, with all these Frenchmen sitting at cafes, pretty French ladies serving them drinks, champagne, of course. Even then.
The remaining members of the original Spanish-speaking Californios, like Vallejo, De Haro, and Sanchez, who once governed and owned large rancheros, are now overwhelmed and internationalized during the cataclysmic moment of the gold rush. The gold rush jump-starts San Francisco, pushing it into a well-deserved reputation for hedonism. Its population is dominated by young single males, fueled by gold dust, and looking for excitement in saloons, gambling houses, and bordellos.
On the low end, you have cribs, which are small wooden shanties where prostitutes plied their trade. Some of them would hang out of them naked to the waist, offering men to touch one breast for 10 cents, two breasts for 15 cents, or 25 cents to $1 to step inside.
Well, it was the world's greatest stag party. There's also many touching stories at that time of men who would literally break into tears when they would see a woman walking down the street, or particularly children. Children greatly affected the men at that time because there were so few families here. And so the sight of a child was something that was just really extraordinary and deeply touching for many of these men.
In 1850, when California is admitted to the Union, John Geary becomes the first mayor of San Francisco. And while the city has acquired a well-deserved reputation for vice and sin, it is also a place of cultural good times, with dancers, singers, minstrels and troubadours, and famous performers of the day like Lola Montez, Edwin Booth, and Lotta Crabtree.
Ever since the gold rush, San Francisco has been a theater town. It's a place where the miners love the dance halls and performers, and especially the opera. The opera goes as far back as the city goes.
San Francisco's first opera was performed at the French-run Adelphi Theater. The opera was La Sonnambula by Vincenzo Bellini. It was sung by Signor Pellegrini's opera troupe 3 years after gold was discovered.
When Birth of a City returns, the early years produce a dark side of violence, chaos, and San Francisco under siege.
We now return to KRON-4 Presents San Francisco, Birth of a City.
San Francisco, I believe, has the most disagreeable climate and locality of any city on the globe. The rainy season closes to what is miscalled summer. A season so cold that you require more clothing than you did in January. So damp with fogs and mists that you are penetrated to the very marrow. So windy that if you are abroad in the afternoon, it is a continual struggle. Eliza W. Farnham.
The city's early growth had a dark side. Living conditions were often unsanitary. There was a lack of safe drinking water, garbage on its muddy streets, even disease. A cholera outbreak in 1850 claimed 500 lives.
It was disease-ridden. People died right and left. There weren't proper burial grounds at first, and it was just a disaster, a chaos.
Then came the fires. Between December of 1849 and June of 1851, there were 6 fires, which destroyed much of the city.
And in one description I came across, they talk about these flames being sucked underneath these wooden sidewalks, and these flames would go shooting along under the sidewalks and suddenly appear in a totally different part of town.
Some fires were accidental, but many were set purposely by a notorious group called the Sydney Town Ducks, ex-convicts from Australia who wanted to loot and rob. The city was also unprepared for a more severe kind of lawless frontier mentality where men must carry guns for self-protection.
The situation finally gets so out of control that the town's leading businessmen essentially organize themselves as a private army, as a private peacekeeping force, and they take the law into their own hands.
Public frustration and outrage led to the formation of 2 committees of vigilance, one in 1851, then a second 5 years later. A dangerous, violent time. There was fear of open insurrection during the turbulent summer of '56. In a letter to her daughter, Mary Jane McGuire revealed the fear of living in San Francisco.
My dear Angie, many can neither eat nor sleep. They say law and order people will plunder and burn the city, and there's no knowing what will become of women and children. It looks very like war to go through our streets in the evening and see thousands of bayonets glimmering in the moonlight.
The illegal takeover of San Francisco by the 8,000-member Committee of Vigilance has no parallel in American history. It was in effect a coup d'etat by vigilantes who seized control of the existing government. No other American city has ever endured this kind of experience. Buried in the cemetery of Mission Dolores are 2 of the 4 men who were executed by the committee. Dozens were also jailed and banished. As for Mary Jane McGuire, she left San Francisco and never returned. By 1857, almost a decade after James Marshall's historic discovery at Sutter's Mill, the value of gold taken out by the miners exceeded some $500 million. But San Francisco had become its own commercial emporium, built not by the miners who passed through, but by the city's entrepreneurs and merchant class who made their own fortunes. Living in the fashionable neighborhood of Rincon Hill and South Park were the city's well-to-do.
One of the things that's most interesting about the 1850s is the speed with which an aristocratic society formed itself in San Francisco. And the other interesting thing is that this early aristocracy is heavily Southern. So as the Civil War approaches, it actually becomes a question about whether California is actually going to stay in the Union or not. Because many of these, the town's best citizens, are siding with the Confederacy and want California to secede from the Union as well.
On a September morning in 1859, those pre-Civil War divisions collide in a deadly encounter between 2 of California's most important public figures. David Broderick is an Irishman from New York who came to San Francisco during the gold rush with political ambitions. At the age of 37, Broderick became a United States Senator from California.
Broderick was a Democrat of the old pre-Civil War Democratic Party, but was one of the people who did not want slavery.
David Terry is a quick-tempered Southerner from Texas who supports slavery. He arrived in San Francisco in 1849 and became a justice of the California Supreme Court. Broderick and Terry had become bitter political opponents, often critical and insulting to each other. Their personal animosity led to Terry's ultimatum.
So he challenges Broderick to a duel.
Near Lake Merced, in the early morning hours of September the 13th, 1859, the 2 men face each other 30 paces apart. David Broderick fires the first shot and misses. David Terry then takes aim and fires his weapon, hitting Broderick in the chest. 3 days later, Broderick was dead.
In effect, the Broderick-Terry duel is a paradigm, a prophetic paradigm of the Civil War itself.
In the last year of the decade, with its population now at 55,000, San Francisco has already emerged as the most important city in the West. It has published more newspapers than London. The Wells Fargo Company was in business. A female doctor has established a medical practice on DuPont Street. And the cove of Yerba Buena was filled in, creating the financial district. Richard Henry Dana was a young seaman who came to San Francisco in 1835 when it was a small, desolate trading post. 24 years later, Dana has returned. He was overwhelmed by the city's transformation.
Sunday, August 14th. When I awoke in the morning and looked from my window over the city of San Francisco, with its storehouses, towers, and steeples, its courthouses, theaters, and hospitals, its daily journals, its learned professions, its wharves and harbors with their 1,000-ton clipper ships, when I saw all these things and reflected on what I once was and saw here, and what now surrounded me, I could scarcely keep my hold on reality at all.
When Birth of a City returns, San Francisco confronts the Civil War, and a young Mark Twain arrives.
We now return to KRON-4 Presents San Francisco, Birth of a City.
In April of 1861, when the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, it was the beginning of the Civil War. Thousands of miles from its bloody fields of battle, the war will have an impact on California. San Francisco's streets were filled with speech-making and rallies. The patriotic Unitarian minister Thomas Starr King made his impassioned pleas for the Union cause in a plaza near his church, which will later be called Union Square. Because of its southern population, the city was a place of conspiracies and plots to take over California and establish a Confederate republic. Arrests were made and conspirators jailed on Alcatraz Island, where gun batteries were built to protect San Francisco from Southern privateers. It was the riches of gold and silver, however, which caused the most serious concern.
That's one reason the Confederacy, although never able to really pull together a serious attempt to seize San Francisco, always lusted after it. If they could have blockaded San Francisco and kept the Union from getting the gold and silver, that could have strangled the Union's war effort.
California raised money for the Union cause and sent a small number of troops off to war. Then in April of 1865, a few days after the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, San Francisco was again divided when President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated.
Although the majority of the city was in mourning, the southern contingent, or many of them, pulled down their blinds and celebrated behind closed shutters.
The main street of the city, Montgomery Street, is definitely the upper-class district. It is at the same time the Rue de la Paix of Paris, the Piccadilly of London, and the Broadway of New York. Louis Laurent Simonin.
By the middle of the decade, there were over 15,000 buildings in the city. The Cliff House had opened. St. Ignatius College, predecessor of the University of San Francisco, conferred its first degree. And Frank McCoppin was elected the first Irish-born mayor of San Francisco in 1867. The Irish. The Irish came by the thousands, fleeing the terrible famine of their homeland when the gold rush of California was the world's greatest adventure.
It was more than good. California to the Irish was the promised land.
So was San Francisco. From saint to sinner, the Irish were central to the city's evolution. They became its cops and firemen, bankers, physicians, tailors, blacksmiths, lawyers, and politicians. The Irish settled in the Mission District, Bernal Heights, and south of Market neighborhoods. Dublin-born engineer Jasper O'Farrell laid out San Francisco's streets, including his grand design of Market Street, which so angered property owners that he was almost lynched. Irish immigrant Peter Donahue established the city's first ironworks, streetcar railway, and gasworks company, ancestor of PG&E, the Pacific Gas and Electric Company. The Irish were also theater impresarios like Tom Maguire.
He was one of the finest looking men that ever came to this city and dressed the part.
A high-stakes gambler who loved opera and lost as many fortunes as he won, Maguire came during the gold rush, found work as a saloon keeper, and built grand theaters like the Jenny Lind and Maguire's Opera House.
It wouldn't be right to ask Tom Maguire anything about payment. He wasn't that kind of person. So people came not knowing whether they're going to get paid or not. That's the way he run. That's what made him such a character.
Maguire filled his theaters with the great performers of the day, like the noted actor James O'Neill, father of the future American playwright Eugene O'Neill. Maguire also brought to San Francisco the scandalous actress-poet Ada Isaacs Menken. Menken was the star of the action melodrama Mazeppa, and Maguire paid her the rich sum of $500 a night to perform. Menken's most sensational moment occurred when she rode a live stallion, attired in a flesh-colored costume which made her appear almost nude. Maguire's investment paid off. Menken was a box office smash when 30,000 people paid to see her perform during a 2-week period. She also overwhelmed a young Mark Twain, who wrote that Menken was a magnificent spectacle and dazzled my vision. He was a riverboat pilot who fought briefly for the Confederates in the Civil War, sought refuge in the West, mined silver in Nevada, and turned to journalism. He also changed his name from Samuel Clemens to Mark Twain. When he arrived in San Francisco in 1864 from the silver boom in Virginia City, the 29-year-old Twain took a job writing for the city's Morning Call newspaper. Of his new city, he wrote, "I fell in love with the most cordial and sociable city in the Union. After the sagebrush and alkali deserts of the Washoe, San Francisco was a paradise to me."
Mark Twain is all over the map when he's writing here. He's going to the theater, he's reporting on the police, he's going to the city council meetings.
Twain instantly became famous with his celebrated story, The Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. And when he left San Francisco in the spring of 1866, Twain was commissioned to write a series of letters for the Alta California newspaper. It was in the West that he found himself as a writer.
Many of these letters contain small sketches that are clear foretellers of the kind of literature that you and I are familiar with in Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. And I think that there's no doubt in my mind at all that much of what we value in Mark Twain as a writer was learned here in San Francisco.
When Birth of a City returns, the story of San Francisco's greatest entrepreneur, William Chapman Ralston.
We now return to KRON-4 Presents San Francisco, Birth of a City.
In the same year that Mark Twain arrived in San Francisco, the Bank of California opened for business. And though the Civil War had an impact on the city's prosperity in the decade of the 60s, its phenomenal growth was propelled by the riches of the Nevada silver discovery of 1859.
It really wasn't the gold rush that built the city. The gold rush got it going. It was really the Comstock Lode that built San Francisco and the great fortunes.
The great fortunes of men like William Chapman Ralston.
If you wanted to see the most important man in San Francisco at that time, you didn't see the mayor, you went to see the banker, Ralston.
It was Ralston who founded the Bank of California. It was Ralston who monopolized the Comstock mines and then reinvested his wealth to help build San Francisco. Like Mark Twain, Ralston came from the Midwest and worked on Mississippi riverboats in his youth. But unlike Twain, Ralston was obsessed with San Francisco and wanted to make it one of the great cities of the world.
Ralston was one of the great early members of the robber baron generation San Francisco style, and great faults, but also a flamboyance, a love of life, an entrepreneurial energy that was prophetic, really, of the forces that would, in a very short time, make San Francisco the financial capital of the far West.
Ralston prospered. This was his peninsula estate, south of San Francisco. Located on the Belmont campus of the College of Notre Dame, Ralston Hall, as it is now called, was the showplace for entertaining the great and famous of the day, like President Ulysses S. Grant.
Anybody who was anybody just had to come to Belmont, had to get an invitation because it was a sign that you had arrived to be hosted by the most important man in the far West, William Ralston.
A modified Italian villa, Ralston's four-story, 80-room home had 55,000 square feet of grand opulence. A staircase directed guests to a second-floor opera box, which was designed after the one at the Paris Opera House.
Ralston and his wife, Lizzie, in fact, didn't like dancing that much, so they'd sit up here on the second floor in these opera boxes, looking down on their guests dancing below.
Before his marriage to Lizzie Fry, Ralston had loved the granddaughter of New York tycoon Cornelius Vanderbilt. But Vanderbilt did not care for Ralston and sent Louisa, his 19-year-old granddaughter, to Europe to keep them apart. When Ralston's young love returned home, she was sick and soon after died. Ralston never forgot her.
And so Ralston carried a torch for her throughout his life, apparently. He always loved this woman. And Lizzie always knew that she was not his first choice.
In the decade of the 60s, San Francisco continued to expand. A new theatrical sheet called The Daily Dramatic Chronicle was published by the DeYoung brothers. The city had experienced the greatest rainfall in its history in 1862, when 49 inches fell on its streets. The Jewish synagogue Emmanuel was consecrated. The volunteer fire department was now being paid. And in baseball, the San Francisco Pacifics were the state champions. On October 21st, 1868, a severe earthquake hit the city. This was the damage on Market Street, Clay Street. The destruction of property was estimated at $400,000. Some 50 people were injured and 5 were killed. The next year, the first dirigible on the West Coast, called the Avator, made a successful steam-powered flight at 5 miles an hour. And on May 10th, 1869, at Promontory Point, Utah, a ceremony was conducted marking the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. California was now connected by rail with the rest of America. The railroad was the idea of Theodore Judah, a brilliant young engineer who was unable to interest San Francisco's financial community in supporting his dream. Judah turned to 4 Sacramento businessmen, and they formed the Central Pacific Railroad.
And they are the ones who became the Big Four.
Leland Stanford, Mark Hopkins, Charles Crocker, Collis Huntington. All 4 were from East Coast working-class backgrounds who came to California during the gold rush.
Many people would believe that the Big Four are less than honorable men, yes. They were about as ruthless as you can imagine, but they were very much the kind of admired figures of their time.
Construction began in 1863, when Leland Stanford was California's governor. When delays were costing the Big Four money, it was Charles Crocker who wanted to bring in Chinese labor to finish the job. Called Crocker's Pets, it was the Chinese who helped build the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Chinese worked hard, fast, and cheap. They dug tunnels, carved roadbed, helped lay as many as 10 miles of track in a single day, and chiseled into the solid granite of the Donner Pass near Lake Tahoe.
Now imagine in sub-zero weather with hundreds of inches of snow, and the Chinese, thousands of them, and not only chipping away at that solid granite, but using explosive on a very, very difficult and harsh terrain. A lot of Chinese died building that railroad.
But in the warm glow of the extraordinary triumph and celebration in Utah, where Leland Stanford drove the ceremonial golden spike into the final rail of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Chinese were no longer needed or wanted, and the dreamer, Theodore Judah, was dead. The Big Four became multimillionaires and dominated California's political and business landscape for the rest of the 19th century. In the last year of the decade, when San Francisco's population reaches 150,000, its leading citizens believe the new railroad will stimulate trade with the rest of the country, creating a new economic bonanza. It is a false hope. When the boom does not happen, the city will again encounter one of the darkest periods in its history.
When Birth of a City returns, the cable car is born. And in Chinatown, racism explodes into deadly violence.
We now return to KRON-4 Presents San Francisco, Birth of a City.
Golden Gate Park. 3 miles long, half a mile wide, 1,000 lush acres.
It is the great recreation ground of San Francisco, and I think even for a secular culture such as ours, it's as close as you get to holy ground.
But when its development began in 1870, it was a place of politics, intrigue, squatters, and sand. One newspaper described the park's location as a dreary waste of shifting sand hills.
It looked originally like the Sahara Desert.
When he was 24 years old, William Hammond Hall became the park's first designer and superintendent.
He does what many people feel is impossible, begins growing a forest on the sand dunes of western San Francisco. And many people felt he couldn't do it, but by the end of the 1870s, it was clear that it was going to work.
Like Golden Gate Park, Nob Hill had also been a primitive wasteland. In time, it would become the mecca of palatial living for San Francisco's rich and important. Leland Stanford built his mansion at a cost of $2 million.
Which was a mechanical wonder. It had all of the latest devices, and for example, a seating area which was surrounded by plants into which were embedded mechanical birds, and at the push of a button they would all burst into song.
Charles Crocker's estate also cost $2 million and had an art collection worth over $1 million. The home of Mark Hopkins cost $3 million.
So their houses, in fact, represent both a point of pride for San Franciscans and also arrogance, because the railroad was so hated later in the 19th century that these houses represent almost feudal nobility on top of the hill.
But the spectacular growth of Nob Hill happened because of the invention of the cable car.
Andrew Halliday was a brilliant Scots inventor who, as early as the age of 18, was designing suspension bridges up in the Sierra.
When Andrew Halliday arrived in San Francisco in 1857 and opened business, the principal methods of public transportation were horse-drawn carriages and steam cars. Neither was satisfactory for San Francisco's imposing hills. But Halliday had been successful with his system of wire rope, hauling gold and miners out of the Sierras.
And he adapted these continuous cables for the ore skips to the cable car by running them in a slot in the street.
Halliday's continuous street cable was powered by a steam generator. Cynics called it Halliday's Folly. But on the cold and foggy morning of August 2nd, 1873, history was made. With friends on board and Halliday at the controls, because the gripman had fled in fear at the last moment, the first San Francisco cable car made a run from Nob Hill, down Clay Street to Kearny, and then back up Clay Street's steep 300-foot grade.
The cable car had a tremendous impact on the spread of San Francisco because they could go anywhere. They could go up the steepest hill, and they could go out even into the sand dunes. And so everywhere that the cable cars were built, the land values appreciated, and houses sprang up like mushrooms after a rain.
Two years after Halliday's success, William Ralston built the Palace Hotel at a cost of $7 million. One local newspaper called it the finest hotel on the face of the earth.
Said he was only 25 years old, and here it had this magnificent hotel that would have been at home in New York, Paris, or Berlin.
Occupying 2.5 acres on Market Street, the palace was 7 stories high and had a drive-through entrance for guests arriving by carriage. There was Irish linen, china from Bavaria, Parisian-trained chefs, and a bar tended by 30 men.
It was often said that, that California was in fact run not from Sacramento, but from the bar of the Palace Hotel. Everybody who was anybody drank at the Palace Hotel, stayed there, lived there, or kept their mistresses in the Palace Hotel.
But William Ralston would never live to see the Palace Hotel open. The 70s were financially turbulent. There was rampant speculation, fortunes won and lost overnight. In 1874, there were 58 suicides in San Francisco. The next year, 64. And Ralston, the financial autocrat of the Pacific, was involved in the struggle of his life.
He's an entrepreneur, but he takes risks. And Ralston's deals went very, very bad in the 1870s.
Ralston's empire was in a great deal of trouble. He was heavily in debt, overextended. And in Nevada, when a rival mining company, the Consolidated Virginia, discovered the richest of all the silver veins of the Comstock in 1873, his stranglehold on Nevada silver came to an end. It was the stake in Ralston's heart.
Ralston eventually lost his money, went bankrupt suddenly, and the bank collapsed on August 26, 1875.
It was called Black Friday. The Bank of California closed its doors, and William Ralston was finished.
When it was revealed that he had essentially embezzled up to $4.5 million from his bank, in fact, was forced to resign by the board and then went for his daily swim and didn't come back alive.
A physician, John Pittman, was one of the last to see Ralston alive before the banker took his swim in the cold waters of the bay. Pittman described the afternoon of his friend's death as blazing hot, the city a furnace of heat.
He drowned in San Francisco Bay, and to this day people debate whether it was suicide or whether it was stress.
At around sunset, Ralston's body was taken from the water near Leavenworth Hill. William Chapman Ralston, the builder and visionary of San Francisco, was dead at the age of 49.
There was a tremendous feeling among San Franciscans that a great man had died. And his funeral was huge, huge.
Ralston's funeral procession was 3 miles long.
Thousands of people, the wealthy, the prestigious, and the workers. So you have this tremendous outpouring of affection for the man.
The Chinese, exotic, often called celestials. They helped build California. In addition to their work on the railroad, the Chinese mined gold, reclaimed lands in the Delta, were California's first migrant workers. In San Francisco, they built successful businesses. Tolerated after their gold rush arrival, their acceptance was short-lived.
The idea of San Francisco as a place of tolerance and liberality and everything is a recent construct. In fact, if you look back in the newspapers of that time, they are viciously racist. The cartoons, the way that various ethnic groups were reported, it didn't vary much from other cities at that time. It was open field day on virtually anybody, unless you were white Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
In the 50s, a series of laws were enacted against the Chinese. They could not vote, own land, attend school with whites. There was even a pigtail ordinance, which required them to cut off their traditional queues, the long braided hair worn down their back. The Chinese were also not allowed to testify against whites in a court of law.
Which means that if a Chinese got murdered or beaten or robbed by a white, the testimony cannot be used in court against the assault or the robber. So it was, that's how the phrase Chinaman's chance, came to our language. That Chinese really have zero chance in a very racially hostile environment. And so many Chinese withdrew eventually into what we now call Chinatowns, the urban ghettos. And in fact, Chinatown is really an institutional monument for racism.
When unemployment and depression impacted San Francisco in the 70s, big business and labor engaged in a bitter economic struggle. Chinese became a natural scapegoat for unemployed white workers. One of the most violent incidents against the Chinese occurred on July 23, 1877, when angry mobs attacked them and destroyed a number of their businesses. Police and a quickly formed Committee of Safety fought running battles with the rioters.
You had at one point a federal gunboat anchored offshore of San Francisco in case the city succumbed totally to rioting.
The rage and frustration continued 2 days later when a rumor spread that the Pacific Mail Steamship Company had brought in more Chinese immigrants. The Beale Street Wharf was set on fire. Shooting broke out. When it was over, 18 were wounded and 4 were dead. The summer of discontent had reached its flashpoint.
I mean, when you read these things, there's a strong sense of rage. You know, how could this be?
6 months after the anti-Chinese riots, representatives of the Chinatown community, seeking justice, delivered an impassioned address before a joint committee of the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States.
Where is that liberty your fathers fought for? That a mob led by aliens can undisturbed hold their daily gatherings and threaten to hang your best citizens, burn their property, and denounce them as thieves? We do not desire to approach you as suppliants, as one of the fundamental principles of this great government is that all men are born free and equal.
When Birth of a City returns, San Francisco's infamous Barbary Coast and the notorious world of Shanghaiing.
We go on down to Pacific Street, the roughest and least Pacific of the streets on the Barbary Coast. The whole street for half a dozen blocks is literally swarming with the scum of creation. Albert S. Evans.
The Barbary Coast was a legendary no-man's land of saloons, bordellos, gambling joints, and opium dens. Actress Sarah Bernhardt called it the most fascinatingly wicked place on earth. The location of the Barbary Coast was in the heart of San Francisco's waterfront district of Broadway, Pacific, and Jackson Streets. It took its name from the infamous pirate-infested Barbary Coast region of North Africa.
There were a lot of people who were looking for quick and easy money in the Barbary Coast at night. And you had to keep your wits about you. There was murder, there was mayhem.
The Barbary Coast was also the center of the vicious and abusive slave trade called Shanghaiing.
San Francisco was the most notorious Shanghaiing port in the world during the 1880s and later.
Shanghaiing. It was illegal, at times even murderous. Unsuspecting victims were beaten into submission. But most often they were supplied with Mickey fins, drinks of alcohol spiked with drugs. After passing out, the victim was taken to a ship anchored in the bay, bound for ports around the world like Shanghai.
The next thing you know is he's 50 or 100 miles outside the Golden Gate, headed for the Arctic Ocean on a 1 or 2 year whaling voyage.
With a price of around $100 per body, fortunes were made in this human slave trade.
And Shanghaiing went on from 1849 until about 1915 here, for a period of 65 years. So if you say 2,000 people per year were shanghaied for 65 years, that was 130,000 people. It was a very, very cruel practice.
In the 80s, the notorious and corrupt Chris Buckley became San Francisco's first political boss. The eccentric, self-appointed Emperor Norton, one of the city's most legendary characters, died. Comstock millionaire George Hearst became the owner of a local newspaper, the San Francisco Examiner. And when his 23-year-old son, William Randolph Hearst, assumed control, young Hearst hired the best talent available, writers like Ambrose Bierce and Jack London. On Broadway in 1886, Fior d'Italia, the oldest Italian restaurant in the country, opened for business. It was located in the heart of North Beach, home of the Italians.
This was very much like their Italy that they had left behind. The bay, the blue waters of the Mediterranean, the sunny climate.
The first Italians came from the northern provinces of Genoa and Tuscany, and they settled in the Latin Quarter district near Telegraph Hill in the 1850s. Later immigrants arrived from Naples, Lucca, and Sicily. Ligurians and Tuscans were garden farmers who turned sand dunes into fertile patches of lettuce and artichokes. Genoese and Sicilian fishermen sailed their feluccas in search of the rich harvest in San Francisco's bay. A.P. Giannini made a small fortune in the wholesale produce business, retired at age 31, and then formed the Bank of Italy, which eventually became the world's largest, the Bank of America. An Italian merchant, Domingo Ghirardelli, brought chocolate from Peru and established a lasting business.
And this is right with the gold rush. Right with those early gold rush settlers. He comes into San Francisco, he sets up shop, starts to make chocolate. He's very successful. So he's the first of the Italian big-time entrepreneurs.
The Italians build their own community in North Beach, and they will become American. It was also that way for the Jews. This is the Haas Lilienthal house, and it was built in 1886. This storybook home is also a symbol of how important and successful the city's Jewish merchant class was in the 19th century.
They became bankers, millionaire manufacturers.
Leaving behind centuries of European anti-Semitism and persecution for the gold rush in 1849, most were Jews from Germany who assimilated easily into this new world. Here they practiced their religion and retained their Jewish traditions, but there were some who celebrated Easter and Christmas.
They came here at the same time with other pioneers, and they suffered the same deprivations and the same successes as others.
The Jews transformed their lives from modest shopkeepers and miners to real estate developers and department store magnates. Levi Strauss built an empire selling blue jeans to miners. Solomon Gump created a retail establishment importing elegant treasures from around the world. Gump's became a San Francisco landmark. The Jews raised families, built major industrial enterprises, and impacted the city's politics, higher education, and philanthropy.
They really felt that it belonged to them. They were part of it, like in no other city in the United States. Here, they had an equal chance.
When Birth of a City returns, San Francisco becomes a winter wonderland, and life for its black citizens turns bittersweet.
In addition to the Hearsts, another of the city's important newspaper families were the DeYoungs. Their original 1865 theater sheet was now called the Daily Morning Chronicle. The paper had acquired a reputation for bold and aggressive reporting, but it was also known for another very colorful and contentious brand of journalism.
In fact, it was said that the Chronicle specialized in blackmail, extortion, stock jobbing, virtually anything you could imagine. But it's what people wanted to read, and it gave the DeYoungs power, and it gave them wealth.
It also gave the three brothers enemies. Silver millionaire James Flood had a serious encounter with Charles DeYoung, the editor of the paper.
Mr. DeYoung was down on my great-grandfather for some reason. I'm not sure what reason, but anyway. So he started publishing all sorts of, quote, inaccurate statements about great-grandfather, what a crook he was and this and that. And finally, my great-grandfather got fed up with it in the paper, and he went down with a revolver And he said to Mr. DeYoung in his office, he says, I intend to use this on you next time you publish something about me, and walked out of the office. And there was never anything printed about my great-grandfather after that. So he got his point across, I guess.
There was more. In 1879, Charles DeYoung, the oldest of the brothers, engaged in a bitter public feud with Baptist minister Isaac Collick, who was running for mayor of San Francisco. The Chronicle published unflattering details of Collick's past, the most sensational that Collick was an adulterer.
And the minister then attacks Charles DeYoung from the pulpit, claiming that the mother DeYoung ran a whorehouse in St. Louis.
Charles DeYoung was outraged at the insult to the family name. He confronted the minister and shot him. Collick recovered from his wounds and was elected mayor. But DeYoung continued his attacks into the next year. It would cost him his life.
And the minister's son went over to the Chronicle offices and shot Charles dead.
Charles DeYoung was dead at the age of 35. The minister's son was tried for murder and acquitted. Michael DeYoung was now the publisher of the Chronicle.
Michael DeYoung doesn't seem to learn much from his brother's fate because, in fact, in the early 1880s, he takes on the Spreckles family, and the Spreckles family were just too big and too mean to take on.
Michael DeYoung published frequent stories and editorials alleging fraud and other misconduct by the Spreckles Hawaiian Commercial and Sugar Company. Adolph Spreckles sought revenge. In November of 1884, he confronted DeYoung and shot him twice. DeYoung survived. Spreckles was later tried for attempted murder and acquitted.
Generally, in this realm of society at that time, you could get off on reasonable cause very easily. There seemed to have been almost no libel laws at that time, which makes the newspaper reading incredibly colorful and exciting.
Today, the DeYoung's newspaper is published as the San Francisco Chronicle. During the 80s, the Geary Street Railroad was in service. The city's police force expanded to 400. And the celebrated English writer Oscar Wilde, visiting San Francisco, referred to Lily Langtry, the star attraction at the Baldwin Theater, as the Lily of Love. In the early winter of '87, San Francisco became a winter wonderland when a snowstorm covered the city. It was an uncommon sight. The white flakes fell all day. As much as 7 inches of snow accumulated on Twin Peaks. It was the city's greatest snowfall. But beneath San Francisco's quiet charm and beauty lay a bittersweet reality of promise unfulfilled. The antipathy toward the Chinese continued when national exclusionary laws were enacted, prohibiting Chinese immigration and the opportunity for U.S. citizenship. In the decade of the 80s, San Francisco also became a city of contradictions for its black population. Like the Chinese, black pioneers arrived in San Francisco during the Gold Rush. They came overland with Army officer John Fremont, as sailors on ships from Panama and around the Horn, as freedmen and slaves looking for the promise of a better life, where men like George Washington Dennis could buy his freedom and the freedom of his mother, where pre-Gold Rush pioneers like William Leidsdorf could prosper, build the city's first hotel, own a steamship company, and serve as San Francisco's treasurer.
A place as promising as California probably meant much more to them than it did to others because it gave them an area to exercise a freedom, economic freedom, social freedom that they wouldn't have in the South.
In San Francisco, blacks established their own churches, built homes, published newspapers. Most were working-class people. A few had small businesses, some owned real estate. Eventually, blacks suffered from the same discrimination as the Chinese. Blacks could not vote, serve on a jury, hold public office.
Anyone who wanted to take advantage of them could. They couldn't testify in court. Their children went to segregated school in San Francisco in the 1850s and 1860s.
Blacks were also not allowed to ride San Francisco streetcars. Among those who filed suit was Mary Ellen Pleasant, a successful boarding house keeper of wealth and influence who had been removed from a city streetcar in 1866 because of her race. After long and difficult legal battles, California finally enacted an anti-discrimination law allowing blacks access to public transportation. The year was 1893. The struggle for civil rights was unending. Blacks could not overcome their lack of political power, white prejudice, and white labor unions.
The Palace Hotel incident typifies the promise of San Francisco and also the paradox.
In 1875, when the Palace Hotel opened, some 200 service jobs went to blacks. But that all changed in the 80s with the rise of the labor movement sweeping the country.
They start consolidating their power and taking away the traditional jobs the African Americans held. Black men who had jobs in hotels, responsible positions, were replaced through one ruse or another by white working men, and that was it.
By the end of the decade, San Francisco's population was approximately 300,000. The number of black citizens in the city was around 1,800. Their population was small, and it would remain that way for all of the 19th century.
When Birth of a City returns, San Francisco's destiny as the Paris of the Pacific.
We now return to KRON-4 Presents San Francisco, Birth of a City.
After the matinee on Saturday afternoons, Market Street from Powell to Kearny was a popular promenade where many of the city's interesting figures passed in review. Actors, writers, politicians, and celebrities of the sporting fraternity, with pretty women to send them flaunting glances. Amelia Ransom Neville.
It was the decade of the gay 90s and ragtime music, and 1 in 4 Californians lived in San Francisco. From their gold rush population of some 8%, women were now almost half the state's population. Isadora Duncan, who would become a world-famous dancer, was teaching dance at the age of 14. In 1892, in college football, the first big game was played. Stanford defeated California 14-10 at the Haight Street Field. And to the women of the city who offered flaunting glances, he was known as Pompadour Jim. But James J. Corbett of San Francisco was better known to the boxing world as Gentleman Jim. Corbett became the heavyweight champion of the world when he knocked out the legendary John L. Sullivan in the 21st round of their championship fight in New Orleans. Corbett would remain the heavyweight champion for almost 5 years.
And the Irish Americans, even though Corbett was Irish, they resented the fact that their great idol, John L. Sullivan, had been beaten by this upstart dude they called Corbett. And because Corbett was a clothes horse, Gentleman Jim was something that he relished.
It was called the Midwinter International Fair, and it opened in January of 1894 in Golden Gate Park. Promoted by civic leaders like publisher Michael DeYoung to help boost a local economy adversely affected by a worldwide depression, visitors were entertained by a wide variety of pavilions, trade exhibits, animal acts, bands, restaurants, and concessions. It was California's first World's Fair, and in the 6 months it was open, 2.5 million people attended. That same year, San Francisco, weary of political corruption and fearful of its precarious business climate, elected a new mayor, Adolph Sutro, a highly popular 65-year-old millionaire. A Prussian Jew, Adolph Sutro came to San Francisco in 1851, ran a mercantile business, and went to Nevada when the Comstock Lode was discovered. Sutro built a mining tunnel, sold out for millions, and returned to San Francisco buying some 10% of the city's real estate. He also built a great private estate overlooking the Pacific, the world-famous Sutro Baths in 1896, and rebuilt the Cliff House, one of the city's great social gathering places.
And he was a great art collector at the same time, a great bibliophile. He collected whole libraries in Europe and brought them to San Francisco. This is the root of the Sutro Library, which is still here today.
When he was elected San Francisco's 24th mayor, Sutro was the city's first Jewish mayor.
One of the most colorful of all San Francisco citizens and certainly of its mayors. He's only mayor for 2 years, in fact, and he's not used to operating in a corrupt and democratic system, and so he, in fact, leaves office totally insane. He scarcely knows who he is when he leaves office and only lives for a year longer. It was a very sad end to an extremely illustrious career.
San Francisco in the 90s continued to flourish. The Ferry Building opened at the foot of Market Street. The DeYoung Museum became a permanent fixture in Golden Gate Park. The Chutes provided entertainment on Haight Street. And in January of 1897, James Duval Phelan was inaugurated as the last mayor of San Francisco in the 19th century. Urbane, sophisticated, aristocratic, the 36-year-old Phelan wanted to make his city the equal to Europe's great capitals.
San Francisco by 1899 is the undisputed leader, urban center of the far west. It's a period of great optimism for San Francisco. They feel that everything is going their way and nothing can go wrong or stop them from their destiny of becoming the Paris of the Pacific.
In the 5 decades since the gold rush, San Francisco emerged from its humble beginnings as a small trading post to a thriving and important metropolis which controlled California's destiny. The Spanish-American War of 1898 had also transformed San Francisco and the Presidio from a minor frontier outpost to the most important military base in the Pacific and the gateway to Asia.
It's the last year of a remarkable decade, and Frank Norris, a young San Francisco writer, writes one of the most charming novels ever set in San Francisco, Blix, B-L-I-X, in which, in 1899, the two lovers, based upon Norris and his wife, stand on a high hill in the Presidio overlooking the Golden Gate and think of their joy and their sense of good fortune of being here in this great world city, in this great site at the dawn of a new century.
San Francisco convulsed, endured, prospered. From sand dunes to grand avenues, its life in the 19th century was filled with epic drama. The gold rush, a world migration, great wealth and fortunes, vendetta and retribution, racism, scandal, empire building. In the end, though, San Francisco's story was the story of its people. The countless builders and dreamers, uncommon, imperfect, remarkable. Men and women who saw possibilities, wanted to make a new life, and proved that anything was possible in San Francisco. In the last year of the 19th century, the population of the city by the Golden Gate was approximately 350,000. San Francisco had become the new Eden.
Tomorrow night on KRON 4, a devastating earthquake strikes the city of San Francisco in 1906, killing thousands. The subsequent fire leaves over 250,000 people homeless and a city on the brink of extinction. That's next time on KRON 4 Presents San Francisco Into the Fire. To learn more about San Francisco, Birth of a City, go to KRON4.com.
San Francisco, Birth of a City was a production of KRON 4 Presents. Brought to you by your local Ford store.